and we're going to lose another generation of farmers.
Tonight, many of America's farmers already feeling the pinch are worried about the possibility of more challenges.
There was a time when American wheat was more than just a crop. It was a symbol of reliability, strength, and economic power. It fed the world, from the bustling bakeries of Paris to the noodle factories of Seoul. For decades, if you needed grain, you turned to the United States. It was the safe bet, the steady supplier. The world trusted American wheat not just for its quality, but for something even more valuable: consistency. But in 2025, that trust cracked. Not with fiery speeches or tariffs, but with a silent shift in purchase orders. One by one, longtime allies and customers of US wheat made a different choice. They didn't announce it with grand declarations. They didn't broadcast it across trade conferences. Instead, they quietly signed contracts elsewhere, some with competitors, others with former underdogs. And more often than not, that elsewhere was Canada. Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this, and if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. Now onto the video. This wasn't just a seasonal disruption or a price war, it was a systematic realignment, a shift in loyalty that cut deep into the very soil of America's heartland. Farmers who once saw their harvests sail across oceans now see their silos filling, their contracts vanishing, and their futures dimming. And here's what makes it worse. This collapse didn't come because American wheat was bad. In fact, it was often cheaper than its competitors. But cheap doesn't mean trustworthy. And in an era of global risk, trust beats price every single time. In this video, we uncover how America, once the undisputed king of global wheat, lost 5 of its biggest clients in less than a year. From the Philippines to Italy, these nations didn't leave because of cost. They left because of chaos, politics, and broken promises. And while America debated policy, Canada quietly took over. This is not just about agriculture. This is about what happens when a country loses its most important export: trust. The shock began not in Europe or across the southern border, but thousands of miles away in Southeast Asia. The Philippines, a longtime ally and loyal customer of American agriculture, made a move that stunned the wheat industry. For decades, the country imported up to 90% of its wheat from the United States. That's about 3 million tons a year, used for everything from pandesal to noodles to baked goods in every grocery store across Manila. American wheat was practically embedded in the Filipino diet. If there was ever a reliable customer, this was it. But in May 2025, the relationship fractured overnight. One of the Philippines' top milling companies cancelled a 12,000-ton shipment of American wheat. There was no delay, no renegotiation, just a flat-out cancellation. Within days, a new contract was signed for a staggering 110,000 tons. But the wheat wasn't coming from Kansas or North Dakota. It was coming from Canada and Australia. This wasn't about price. In fact, US wheat was cheaper by an average of $8 to $10 per ton. But for Filipino buyers, cost had become secondary. The new priority? Stability. Internal reports from the Philippine Department of Agriculture painted a bleak picture for American exporters. US wheat was now viewed as unpredictable, risky, and entangled with the political turbulence coming out of Washington. Every shipment was a gamble. Would it be delayed by tariffs? Would new restrictions come into play? Would it even leave port? Insurance premiums rose, shipping schedules became unreliable, and in some cases, millers were forced to pay extra fees just to ensure their orders didn't get caught in a crossfire of US bureaucracy. Meanwhile, Canadian and Australian wheat arrived on time, every time. Digitally traceable, tested and pre-approved. In Manila, bakery shelves remained full, but the grain behind those loaves had changed. American farmers had no idea. Their crops were ready, their silos were full, but the orders stopped coming. In Kansas, inventory levels in some storage facilities rose by over 40% compared to the previous year. Freight trains loaded with grain sat motionless. There was nowhere to send them. Harvest-ready fields stood untouched. In places like Oklahoma and South Dakota, some farmers resorted to burning their own crops. It was cheaper to destroy the wheat than to store it without buyers. And all this while, in Manila, the cost of bread, especially the beloved pandesal, rose by more than 11% in just 3 weeks. When US shipments failed to arrive, panic set in. But as soon as Canadian wheat filled the gap, prices stabilised almost instantly. There were no newspaper headlines, no speeches, no diplomatic fallout, just a quiet transaction and a quiet betrayal. The Philippines, one of America's most reliable customers, had shifted its allegiance, and no one in the US agricultural sector saw it coming. The most painful part? This wasn't a one-time hiccup. This was the beginning of a pattern. A signal to the rest of the world that the once unshakable trust in American wheat was now very much up for debate. In France, bread is not just food, it's a symbol. A baguette is not simply baked flour, it's a cultural artifact, a matter of national identity. So, when France decided to quietly step away from American wheat in 2020, it wasn't just a trade decision, it was a seismic cultural shift. For decades, France had sourced premium hard wheat from the American Midwest. The baguettes in Paris, the croissants in Marseille, and the pain bio from Strasbourg were all built on one essential foundation: consistency. And for much of the 20th and early 21st century, that consistency came from the United States. But all that changed, subtly and silently. By the end of 2025, France's imports of US wheat had dropped to their lowest levels in more than 20 years. And it wasn't because French farmers suddenly produced more, or because there was a diplomatic falling out. It was because American wheat, once prized, was now failing to meet Europe's rising standards. First, it was shipping delays. European millers couldn't afford to wait. Then came issues with chemical compliance. US wheat shipments repeatedly exceeded EU thresholds for pesticide residue. Specifically, many batches tested above the permissible limits for glyphosate and other chemical agents, causing panic among health-conscious European consumers and regulators alike. And then there was the carbon score, an increasingly important metric in the European Union's climate-forward policy landscape. American wheat, often transported by long-haul rail and shipped transatlantic with limited emissions tracking, simply couldn't compete with Canada's newer, cleaner logistics chains. Suddenly, importers in Marseille, Rouen and Lyon began to look elsewhere. Some turned to Canadian producers who offered not only high-protein, pesticide-compliant grain, but also full traceability, carbon transparency, and near-flawless delivery times. Others, despite a terrible local growing season plagued by rain and flooding, returned to domestic French wheat, viewing the gamble on quality as safer than the chaos of uncertainty with the US. In Kansas, Nebraska, and South Dakota, the impact was immediate. Milling co-ops began scaling back operations. Some postponed harvests, others shelved long-planned expansion projects. Farmers who had built their livelihoods on exports to France were left with full silos and empty order books. Canadian exporters, meanwhile, moved quickly. Export volumes from Saskatchewan and Manitoba to the EU rose by more than 40% compared to 2024. They weren't just meeting EU standards, they were tailoring their grain for them. Smart harvesters, moisture sensors, and AI-based sorting systems ensured every truckload matched European specs. Custom paperwork was prepared before the wheat even left Canadian soil. By late 2025, flour from Canadian prairies replaced American grain in bakeries from Toulouse to Lille. And the most remarkable part? The taste didn't change. Consumers noticed nothing. The bread was just as crusty, the croissants just as flaky. But behind the scenes, the supplier had changed. There was no public debate in France, no anti-American slogans, no press conferences, just a cold, quiet shift. A decision made in boardrooms, not ballots. American farmers watched as their century-old trade relationship crumbled, not from a trade war, but from missed emails, inconsistent regulations, and shipping failures. France didn't leave because US wheat was bad. They left because they couldn't trust it anymore. South Korea has never been loud about its partnerships. It builds relationships slowly, quietly, and with care. And for nearly 4 decades, one of those quiet bonds was with American wheat. In fact, by 2024, the US supplied over 35% of South Korea's wheat imports. It was in their instant noodles, their bread, and even the pastry flour used by companies like Orion and SPC. American wheat wasn't just a trade commodity, it was part of South Korea's food identity. But by mid-2025, that decades-long bond had shattered. The reason? Glyphosate. In early 2025, South Korea announced a major revision to its food safety standards, particularly targeting glyphosate residue, the controversial chemical commonly used in American agriculture. New government guidelines slashed the allowable residue limits, aligning them more closely with stricter EU benchmarks. When tests were conducted, the results were damning. American wheat was regularly testing between 200 and 400 parts per billion, far exceeding the newly established Korean limits. By contrast, wheat from Canada and Australia consistently came in between 30 and 70 parts per billion, well within the safe zone. Korean importers now faced a brutal choice. They could continue importing US wheat and risk fines, shipment rejections, and increased insurance premiums, or switch to Canada or Australia, which offered clean, certified, pre-screened wheat that sailed through customs without delays. They chose the latter. Within months, US wheat's share in South Korea collapsed from 35% to just 17%. Meanwhile, Canadian exports surged past 60%, becoming the dominant supplier. Behind the scenes, Korean food manufacturers were rewriting supplier contracts, some of which had existed for over 20 years. American companies were quietly removed from the vendor lists of major firms. There were no lawsuits, no headlines, just deletion. In Busan and Incheon ports, US shipments dwindled. Warehouses that once handled hundreds of tons of American grain each week now sat half empty. In Washington state and Idaho, key suppliers to the Korean market, farmers slashed wheat acreage and pivoted to alternative crops like flaxseed or barley. Even worse, the cancellation of long-term contracts meant farmers had no visibility into the next harvest cycle. Buyers weren't postponing deals, they were cutting ties altogether. And in the boardrooms of Korea's largest food companies, American wheat was no longer a topic of discussion. All of this happened without a single anti-American speech, without a trade war, and without public backlash. It was a cold, calculated shift based on compliance, and once again, Canada was ready. Canadian suppliers had already pre-certified their wheat under South Korea's new guidelines. Shipments were digitally traceable, tested in real time, and delivered with full chemical transparency. South Korean importers, already tired of American inconsistencies, were eager for this level of precision. So, just like that, the US lost another trusted partner. And what made it worse? South Korea had no political agenda, no alliances to shift. They simply responded to the data, and America failed the test. If France hurt and South Korea stung, the blow from Mexico was a gut punch. Mexico wasn't just a top buyer, it was family, a neighbour, a partner in the North American supply chain. For decades, American farmers counted on Mexico to absorb over 3 million tons of wheat every year. That relationship began to unravel in early 2025. The trigger wasn't pesticides or shipping delays, it was paperwork. Over the past 3 years, US trade policy had become increasingly erratic. One week, there were new export rules. The next, additional declaration forms. Tariffs were introduced, removed, then reintroduced with no warning. It was chaos at the bureaucratic level, and it hit Mexico hard. In one striking example, a major wheat shipment was held up at the Texas-Mexico border for 5 days due to a sudden change in documentation requirements. The delay triggered production stoppages in Sonora, caused bakery shortages in central Mexico, and forced importers to pay unexpected storage fees. That one incident cost several firms hundreds of thousands of dollars, not in product loss, but in operational disruptions. And Mexico had had enough. By mid-2025, US wheat imports to Mexico had fallen by nearly 40%. Imports from Canada, meanwhile, rose by 35%, and Argentina began entering the conversation as a third supplier. The contrast was sharp. Canadian wheat arrived on time with clean, complete documentation. Warehouses in Manitoba even built new testing lines tailored specifically for Mexico's import protocols. The message was clear. Canada was listening. America wasn't. In Arizona and Texas, blending plants began to shut down due to lack of orders. Farmers slashed prices by up to 20% just to move old inventory. Still, Mexican buyers weren't biting. Unlike other countries, Mexico didn't have to hold a press conference to explain the shift. The numbers said everything. By Q2 2025, Canada had officially overtaken the United States as Mexico's #1 wheat supplier. This wasn't a geopolitical maneuver. It was a business decision. Mexico, once one of the most loyal partners to American agriculture, had quietly turned north. And perhaps the most haunting part of all, no one noticed. No headlines, no industry protests, no trade delegations demanding answers. Just a silent migration of contracts, phone calls that stopped coming, and trains that stopped rolling. In 1 year, the United States lost 5 of its most important wheat customers. Not because its product was inferior, but because its policies were unstable, its deliveries were unpredictable, And its reliability, once its greatest strength, was no longer guaranteed. Canada didn't win with marketing. It didn't undercut prices. It didn't wage a trade war. It simply showed up, on time, every time, with clean paperwork, consistent quality, and full transparency. And that was enough. The story of US wheat in 2020 is not just about agriculture, it's about the future of American exports. Because wheat may be the first, but it won't be the last. In a global economy defined by uncertainty, buyers are not just looking for the best product, they're looking for the most reliable partner. The real commodity today isn't grain. It's predictability. So, can the United States rebuild what it's lost? Yes, but only if it changes. Not just pricing strategies, but trade infrastructure, compliance consistency, and most importantly, the way it builds trust. Because once trust is broken, it doesn't return easily. And while America tries to repair it, Canada is already reaping the rewards. Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between? I'd love to hear it.